When launching a new console, there are a lot of reasons why it might not be immediately successful. Maybe the library of launch titles is sorely lacking, or maybe the system itself is hampered by technical issues, or maybe people just don't like the way the dang thing looks. But in the same breath, a bad console launch doesn't always spell doom for a system, but something was bungled, fumbled, or otherwise not as successful as it could have been. So know that just because a console is on this list, that doesn't automatically mean it's a bad console. Maybe the issues got worked out, and that console went on to have a long and successful life, or maybe it slipped into immediate obscurity. And while we had to leave off some major contenders like the Nokia's weird handheld hybrid phone, the N-Gage, or re-releases like the PlayStation Classic, every console on this list could have benefited from a more careful launch, whether that means fixing a bug, putting out better games, or just waiting until the time was right. With that said, this is my top 10 worst console launches of all time.
Number 10.
Nothing is worse than when a console seemingly appears dead on arrival. Well, it should come as a surprise to no one that the major thing that landed the 360 on this list is the dreaded red ring of death. Even just saying those words sends shivers up my spine. So the Xbox 360 is not at all what I would call an unsuccessful system by any means. In fact, when I was working at Best Buy, I sold a ton of these things on launch. But that original launch was so overwhelmingly plagued by a high system failure rate that most gamers I know have the same reaction to any mention of the red ring of death. While not an actual ring, seeing those 3 quadrants light up on your 360 in a particular pattern, which was the result of internal failures, led Microsoft to extend their warranty in hopes of gaining more good faith with the public. These failures were seemingly the results of cutting corners to beat Sony's PS3 to the market, and with Microsoft having gone with many third-party providers in terms of the guts of the 360, making it even trickier to pinpoint the issues immediately, which is also never a good look for any tech company. In spite of these stumbles, however, and certainly not helped by the media doing story after story on such a technical tumble, the Xbox 360 still did succeed. But man, oh man, did it have a rough time of things at launch. And I want to be clear, people came into Best Buy and I'd warned them about these damn things, and they still bought new ones. So you had a good idea how this console was going to do if people were buying new ones, regardless if they got fried or not.
Number 9.
In contrast to the Xbox 360, our next console finds itself on the list due largely to a really common reason, and one that we're going to hear several times before this list is over: a lack of games. Thus is the fate of the Nintendo GameCube. When it came to the day one launch titles in Japan, the choices were Luigi's Mansion, Wave Race Blue Storm, and Super Monkey Ball. That was it. The US had a few more choices like Rogue Leader, Crazy Taxi, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. There were a few others, but there wasn't a huge amount of variety here. So all of those games listed are fun, but I don't think they were the reason to own a GameCube. And yes, more first-party and third-party games would be released, and when Super Smash Bros. Melee released, many felt that the GameCube was saved, but that good old Purple Lunchbox's library never really ended up feeling like it caught up to where it needed to be, which probably contributed to the fact that it had kind of a short lifespan. Other consoles have done a much better job of eventually recovering from a weak launch library, but none of those other consoles have a nifty handle to carry them around by, so at least the GameCube had that going for it.
Number 8.
So once in a while, the launch of a console fails not because of a major technical issue or a weak library of games, but due to external factors like bad timing. And while it probably seemed like a no-brainer for Sony to release a follow-up console to the PlayStation Portable, the mobile gaming ecosystem had changed drastically since then, and the Vita's release in 2011 set it up to fail from the very beginning. Although honestly, by most objective metrics, the launch of the PS Vita wasn't a huge failure. However, the sales plateaued quickly, and despite the Vita's ability to be used in conjunction with the PS3 and PS4, support for the system stayed very, very quiet. There were a couple of eye-catching games like Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom and Mortal Kombat, but there were no real must-plays that couldn't be easily found elsewhere. And yes, there was no big launch disaster like the Red Ring of Death or bad hardware by any means, but rather, it all felt like a muted, poorly timed release that failed to build, and that kept the Vita from ever truly being able to compete in the mobile market. Do I think mobile gaming kind of killed the Vita on arrival? I don't think so. I think what it came down to truly was the functions and the price point. This thing was pretty expensive, and it didn't really do all that much that most of the things your phone could already do. So rather than the argument being it's because of the mobile gaming market, I'm just going to say that it's because the features didn't match that of a mobile phone. And that was a selling point that Sony really stuck to get that 3G coverage with T-Mobile or AT&T or whatever. Combine that with an expensive price point, no one wants to play this thing, let alone develop games for it. However, I was one of those saps that bought one, and I still love my Vita. I was shocked to learn that the Vita was discontinued as recently as 2019, and I guess that just helps to illustrate what a non-entity the console had been for years. It was there, and it was fine, but it started slow out the gate and just never picked up speed.
Number 7.
The PS Vita may have had a long, ghostly life in the shadows, but other consoles burned too bright. I'm talking, of course, about Nintendo's Virtual Boy, the only console that wants you to gently push your face all the way up against its red plasticky surface. There are a lot of things wrong with the Virtual Boy's launch. After a protracted development, it basically got pushed out before it was finished. And on top of that, it was super expensive. There was only a few games for it, the most memorable of which is Mario's Tennis, and that's only memorable because it came included with the system. The Virtual Boy was more of a tech demo than a console, and while it was definitely ambitious, technology was not up to the task of realizing Nintendo's VR dreams, or honestly whatever Nintendo's dreams were when presenting us red-tinted everything, including sales reports. They even tried a big cross-promotion with Blockbuster, but getting a chance to rent the Virtual Boy meant everyone got to try it and say, huh, neat, and then return it back to Blockbuster before never thinking about it ever again. Not to mention, this thing took a bunch of batteries to use if you didn't plug it into the wall. Virtual Boy turned out to be an apt name because this thing never got a chance to be a real boy, no matter how many stars it wished upon.
Number 6.
Close your eyes and picture a Jaguar. Chances are you're envisioning a sleek, versatile, feline killing machine, and not whatever the Atari Jaguar turned out to be. The launch of the Jaguar was such a failure that Atari left the video game console market altogether. It was so bad Atari was like, never mind, just kidding. Forget that our name was ever synonymous with video games altogether, please. We're out. Peace. This is another one that burned out too quickly due to a whole confluence of factors. A bunch of technical issues, the fact that Atari hyped it up as a 64-bit console when that wasn't exactly true, and an inability to compete in a more crowded market. But as always, one of the biggest problems was a lack of games. In fact, the only North American launch titles were the pack-in game Cybermorph and a game called Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy, which might be my favorite game title of all time for a game I've never played. But it was quickly apparent that the Jaguar was a sinking ship, and third-party publishers started to bail, so the amount of games on the console was doomed to stay small. The Jaguar did eventually have a second life in the public domain, but nothing can undo the disaster that it was when it first launched.
Number 5.
When I hear the word Ouya, the first thing I think about is what a crazy presence they had at E3, right before their tiny cube-shaped console was released. And not just because they were giving out free food and beer, but because the pre-release hype is the most memorable thing about the Ouya's launch. It was funded by a very successful Kickstarter, and lots of attention was paid to how easily moddable and customizable it was. It was meant to be a haven for indie games, but when it was actually launched, no one really cared that much for it. Now, the low price point was a major selling point, but in practice, both the controller and console felt kind of cheap and flimsy. And with a limited amount of games and dwindling interest, the Ouya kind of just disappeared. And it's a shame too, because it was a pretty cool idea in theory, but when it was actually released, everyone could see that the product itself didn't measure up to its potential. And it's a pity more didn't come of it because we had one in the old TOVG offices, and we sank so many hours into both Towerfall and Duck Game because both those games rule. But there wasn't really anything else to do with it. Not to mention the fact that a lot of third-party developers brought weird ports of old titles that no one really asked for. Square Enix. But hey, at the very least, the word Ouya is still kind of fun to say, right? Ouya.
Number 4.
Another example of a console that eventually sorted its deal out for the most part after launch was the Nintendo 3DS. Now, the 3DS was hampered by a terrible trifecta of things. a terribly high price point, unappealing games, and a feature that the public thought was cool but unnecessary. And that then led to a lot of weird backtracking that happened in the months after its release. After lots of pre-launch hype that hinged around the 3DS's 3D capabilities, it only took a few months for Nintendo to realize that in spite of an okay library of games, they may have overestimated what people were willing to pay for this sort of thing, and they dropped the price point from $250 to $170. And this happened in a matter of months, not years, months. This obviously irritated people who had already paid full price for this thing, myself included. So Nintendo attempted to make it right with something they called the Nintendo 3DS Ambassador Program, which offered a bunch of free NES and Game Boy Advance titles to people who bought the 3DS at the original price. And as someone who got those games, I'll be the bigger man and say apology accepted. While the NES games were nothing special, getting Metroid Fusion, Yoshi's Island, and many more was actually pretty great. It almost made this bungled launch less of an issue. Almost. The simple truth is, the price point that you're selling your console or portable at is one of the most important things to figure out before launch, not after. And changing it so quickly, then offering the Ambassador Program as a band-aid, felt kind of desperate, and nobody wants that sort of boo-boo. Also, I'm just gonna go ahead and say this, Street Fighter 4 on the 3DS was not a revelation I wanted to have. No one asked for this game, it got no support, and it's one of the worst ports of this game. Now, the 3D factor, the big point of this thing, the reason why they called it the Nintendo 3DS, it's a cool thing to not have glasses. It's a cool thing to use your AR cards to have 3D environments kind of warp around you. Do you guys remember all that cool marketing with Reggie and Bowser? What a cool concept, what a cool idea. In the end, there was no point. And the biggest glaring problem here, Nintendo has already sold millions and millions of the Nintendo 3DS before, and it was called the Nintendo DS. The Nintendo 3DS essentially is an upgraded form of the Nintendo DS. Not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, it's just a thing.
Number 3.
Remember that period of time where it seemed like everyone and their grandma had a Wii? The crossover success of that console was huge. It appealed to people who had never even picked up a video game before. So releasing a follow-up system called the Nintendo Wii U seems like a no-brainer, right? And the Wii U even had a couple of cool asymmetrical party games that aimed to appeal to that same casual crowd. But the sales did not reflect that for a mixture of reasons. Between having terribly low third-party support, a confusing name convention, the console itself just looked like an external hard drive, and a lot of small technical hiccups like a muddled interface and a short battery life for the tablet itself, spelled it out pretty clearly. The Nintendo Wii U never really caught on. But now that Nintendo has achieved so much more success with the Nintendo Switch, I think it's easy to see why. The Nintendo Wii U feels like a prototype for the fusion between console and handheld gaming. Between that and the tech not being there for a true hybrid, and the fact that it's called the Nintendo Wii U, it feels very much like a console caught in the middle of between two generations, unable to commit to any of its ideas or to provide people with a lasting experience beyond its technological hook. More like the Wii U, am I right? No, truth be told, I love the Wii U. I'm like the one person out there that really liked it. So, yeah, you all can fight me in the comments. I don't give a shit. Huge plays, baby.
Number 2.
I think we all agree that surprises are good, right? Like a surprise party or, sorry, give me a minute, I'm sure there are better examples, but maybe not. Because sometimes surprises are very bad and leave everyone around you feeling caught off guard and unprepared. Which is exactly what happened when Sega decided to say screw it and release the Sega Saturn several months early. The Sega Saturn had already been a moderate success in Japan, and Sega thought they could get the drop on the upcoming PlayStation by showing up at E3 and announcing that, actually, right now, the Sega Saturn is available in retails everywhere. This was way earlier than its intended release date in September, a Saturday they were calling Saturn Day. Yeesh! Maybe it's for the best that Saturn Day never arrived, but lots of retailers were not happy with the surprise release. And that's without even mentioning the price point of $399, which set up Sony for one of gaming's greatest mic drops when they simply walked up during their presentation and said,
$299.
By the time the PlayStation came out, it was all over. And I know this thing was named Saturn, but North American consumers did not like it, and they did not put a ring on it.
Number 1.
As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of reasons a console launch can fail. Bad games, bad hardware, bad publicity, or a potent mix of all of the above. But the main thing a console needs to do is just, work. Which is why the top spot on this list goes to something that isn't even technically a console, but more of a service. Google Stadia, Google's cloud-based video game streaming service. And yeah, this is a very recent launch, and there's always a chance that Stadia could recover, I guess. Even in such a short time, the Google Stadia helped prove why consoles are still necessary and why streaming services like this aren't going to take off quite yet in the future. The technology's just not there yet, and many games haven't been able to stream in 4K as advertised or even maintain a steady frame rate. Stadia is a major conceptual leap, and it's not totally clear to me why Google thought there was a demand for this kind of thing, especially given a library of games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey and Mortal Kombat 11 that could easily be obtained elsewhere, with basically zero eye-catching exclusives attached to it. Plus, calling it a streaming service made people assume it was a Netflix for games, which actually would have been a much better approach. But even then, that's assuming you can stream things with any sort of reliability. And even if they eventually do get it working smoothly, there's just something to be said about having a piece of hardware that you can, see and know that it's doing its job in front of you. Google Stadia rushed a release before it was even ready, with an unimpressive game library, and is conceptually confusing to most consumers, so there's no surprise that it has to cap out this list. But it can't even clear the bar of being a console, which is why Google Stadia is my number 1 worst console launch of all time. You can't say it's a console, but it's not a console, and then say it's not a console when it should be a console. Does that make sense? It makes sense to me. That was my top 10. Let me know what yours are in the comments down below. And if you hate me for it, I don't care. I've been Gerard the Completionist, and I'll see you next week for another brand new episode. Bye-bye.